My name is Christina. Now I have a family I once dreaded even dreaming of. My husband, Dennis, calm and reliable, and my daughter, Anya, my personal source of light and meaning. We live in a small town near Kazan, and looking back on my life now, it might seem like everything was easy. But at 19, I thought very differently. My college graduation day should have been a celebration. I was standing in the courtyard of the academic building, still in my gown, diploma in hand, when my stepmother, Ludmilla, called me aside. She had that same forced smile on her face, too polite to be sincere. I immediately felt alarm. "Christina," she began softly, "we need to talk." I smiled back, not yet knowing that in a minute everything I believed in would crumble. "The money your father saved, it won't go to you." The words sounded so casual, as if they were talking about buying groceries. I didn't even immediately understand the meaning. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Dad said it was a fund for my education." Ludmilla shrugged. "Maxim and I decided it would be wiser to use this money differently now. He has an idea, a project. You're creative, after all. It's not a given that you need university at all." Maxim, my stepbrother, stood nearby, clearly listening. A second later, he came closer, a smug smile on his face. "Chris, don't make a big deal out of it. I'll invest the money wisely. And if you really want to study, loans are still a thing." I felt my hands shaking. "It's not your money. Dad left it to me." Ludmilla suddenly lowered her voice. "Don't make a scene. You're an adult. It's time to learn to manage on your own." That evening, I sat in my room and stared at the ceiling. My father had died a year ago, and only then did I fully understand how much he'd been my rock. Without him, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Dennis was my boyfriend then. When I told him, he got angrier than I expected. "It's unfair. You don't have to put up with this." But legally, everything was registered to Ludmilla. I could have fought, but I had no strength. I decided to keep quiet and just leave. I got a job as a waitress, then worked part-time at a store, and studied part-time. Sometimes it felt like I was just surviving. Meanwhile, Maxim was building a business and spending money without shame. Ludmilla told everyone what a great guy he was, but she called me, still finding myself. We occasionally crossed paths. At family dinners, Maxim would crack jokes about my work, and Ludmilla would pretend to defend me. But every comment she made felt like a sting. The hardest part wasn't the lack of money, but the feeling that no one wanted me there. I made a promise to myself. I would get out. Not for revenge, but for myself. And it was from that moment that everything began to change. I moved out of Ludmilla's house 2 weeks after graduation. There were no big scenes, no slamming doors, or tearful goodbyes. I simply packed my bag, put my documents together, and moved to a rented room on the outskirts of town. Dennis helped me carry my things, kept silent the entire way, and I looked out the minibus window and felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. I was 19 with no family support, no money, no clear plan. But for the first time in a long time, I breathed freely. The room was small, with a sagging sofa and peeling wallpaper, but it was my own. I barely slept the first night, listening to the noises behind the wall and wondering what I'd gotten myself into. I got up early the next morning and went to an interview at a cafe near the train station. They hired me right away. The schedule was tough, with 12-hour shifts, but I accepted without hesitation. I needed the money fast. The first few months merged into one endless cycle. Work, school, then more work. I enrolled in a local university's correspondence program. Not what I'd dreamed of, but it was the only option I could afford. Dennis was already working as an engineer by then, and often helped out, not with money, I wouldn't allow that, but with activities. He'd meet me after late shifts, bring me food, sometimes just sit next to me when I was silent from exhaustion. Sometimes I caught myself envying Maxim. He had money, connections, the certainty that the world owed him something. All I had was stubbornness and the constant worry that I wouldn't be able to cope. Ludmilla didn't call. It was as if, by cutting me out of her life, she'd also cut out the very need to pretend she cared about me. We did run into each other once. It was at a mutual friend's birthday party. Maxim arrived with a noisy group, talking about his plans, his future business, speaking loudly, with feigned confidence. When he saw me, he grinned. "Still working as a waitress?" he asked, his voice still raised. It must be tough. I clenched my teeth and calmly replied, at least it's honest. He chuckled, as if I'd said something naive, and turned away. That evening, I couldn't sleep for a long time, replaying the conversation over and over again. It was painful, but somewhere deep inside, a stubborn feeling grew. I would prove, first and foremost, to myself that I could do more. Studies were hard. I fell asleep over my notes, wrote term papers at night, sometimes cried from frustration. Money was constantly tight. There was a period when I had to choose between transportation and a decent meal. I learned to count every penny and appreciate the little things. A good shift, free coffee at work, a day without rush jobs. In my second year, I experienced unexpected luck. A professor noticed my work and offered me a part-time job helping with a project for a small company. The pay wasn't much, but it was the first money I'd earned that wasn't physical labor. I was afraid of screwing up, and I spent the night working on assignments, but I managed. This feeling, being valued for my intelligence, not my stamina, was almost unfamiliar. Gradually, my life began to improve. I traded the cafe for an office job, cut back on my shifts, and started studying harder. Dennis and I moved in together and rented a small but bright apartment. Sometimes, in the evenings, I caught myself smiling for no apparent reason. It was a new sensation. I tried not to think about Ludmilla and Maxim, but the past still reminded me of itself. At family celebrations of mutual friends, I could feel their glances and overhear snatches of conversations. Maxim was still making plans, Ludmilla was still pretending everything was under control. And I simply moved forward, step by step, even when it was scary. I didn't yet know that a real turning point lay ahead, that the roles would reverse, that one day I would have to face them in completely different circumstances. Back then, I thought of only one thing: to endure. And that was enough. By graduation, I was almost exhausted, but something inside me had emerged that had never been there before. Confidence. Not loud, not ostentatious, but quiet and stubborn. I knew that if I'd made it through all this, then I wouldn't be so easily broken. I defended my thesis with a fever and almost no sleep. The day before, I'd finished my shift and finished a presentation on Dennis's old laptop, which froze every 10 minutes. When the committee asked the last question and nodded, accepting the work, my knees began to tremble. I went out into the hallway, sat on the windowsill, and for the first time in a long time, allowed myself to cry, not from pain, but from relief. I had made it. Only Dennis and a couple of close friends were at the graduation ceremony. I deliberately didn't invite anyone else. I didn't want to see fake smiles or hear the words of people who hadn't seen my sleepless nights. When I went to pick up my diploma, Dennis looked at me as if I'd won the Olympics. At that moment, I realized this recognition was enough for me. I didn't find a job right away. There were many rejections, dubious offers, and interviews after which I wanted to disappear. But eventually, I was hired at a small agency as a junior specialist. The salary was modest, but the prospects were real. I took on everything. I took on extra tasks, stayed late, and learned as I went. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that I was living on autopilot again, but now it had meaning. A year later, Dennis proposed to me. Without fanfare, at home, in the kitchen, with a cup of tea and a trembling voice. I said yes right away, without a second thought. We married modestly, without any extravagance, but with the feeling that this was the beginning of something truly ours. And almost immediately after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. Pregnancy changed me more than I expected. I became softer, but somehow more confident. When Anya was born, the whole world seemed to shrink to her breath, her tiny fingers, and her warm scent. I looked at her and swore to myself that she would never feel unwanted. Never. I didn't quit my job. I returned from maternity leave earlier than I planned. It was scary, difficult, but I made it through again. Management noticed. They began to trust me with projects, then with people. For the first time in my life, I was praised not out of politeness, but genuinely. And each time, along with the joy, a strange emptiness appeared. I wished someone from my past would see it, but no one did. I hardly heard about Ludmilla and Maxim. She only heard snippets from mutual friends that things weren't going so smoothly for them. Maxim's business was failing, his debts were mounting, and the confidence he'd been so proud of was evaporating. Ludmilla was appearing in public less and less, as if the world had suddenly lost its kindness to her. One day I ran into them at the store. I was with Anya, choosing groceries for dinner. They looked tired and lost. Ludmilla forced a smile, and Maxim looked away. We exchanged a few polite phrases and parted ways. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. After that encounter, they became more active. First messages, then phone calls. Ludmilla wrote as if nothing had happened, asking about Anya's health and how we were doing. Maxim suddenly remembered that he had a sister. Dennis said that maybe they wanted to mend fences. I remained silent, but inside everything tightened. I knew all too well what lay behind their sudden warmth. The answer came unexpectedly. They came to my house. I stood at the door, listening to Ludmilla talk about family, about how important it is to stick together, how unfair life can be. And then came the reason they had come. Money. Help. Temporary help. At that moment, I realized how far I had come from that 19-year-old girl in a graduation gown. I looked at them and felt neither guilt nor fear. Only clarity. And that's when I had to make a choice that finally put an end to everything. I let them into the house, but I immediately understood it was a formality. An invisible wall already stood inside me, and neither Ludmilla nor Maxim could break it down, even if they tried very hard. They sat at the kitchen table, where Anya had been drawing on napkins with markers that morning, and looked like strangers there, as if they had entered a space that wasn't theirs. Ludmilla spoke first. Softly, cautiously, choosing her words carefully, as if walking on thin ice. She talked about difficulties, about health, about how everything had changed and how difficult life had become. Sometimes she looked at me with the same expression she used to have when she deprived me of my right to choose. Only now there was anxiety in her gaze. Maxim was silent, twirling his cup in his hands and avoiding eye contact with me. When she finally got to the point, I wasn't even surprised. Money. They needed help. A little. Temporarily. Until everything gets better. Ludmilla said it almost in a whisper, as if afraid to scare away the chance. I listened and felt a strange calm. Not anger. Not resentment. Emptiness. All the words that had once been stuck in my throat no longer had any power. I let them finish speaking, and then quietly but firmly said that I wouldn't help. Maxim flared up immediately. He spoke sharply, reproachfully, reminding me that they gave me a roof over my head, that I was obligated. Ludmilla chimed in, but without her former confidence. She spoke about family, about duty, about leaving the past in the past. I looked at them and suddenly understood clearly. They hadn't changed. They weren't ashamed. They were uncomfortable. Those are different things. I reminded them about the foundation, about the humiliation, about the years I spent surviving while they lived off me. Ludmilla tried to interrupt, but for the first time, I didn't let her. My voice didn't tremble. I didn't shout. I simply spoke the truth. When Maxim resorted to insults, I stood up and opened the door. I felt no triumph, only relief. It wasn't revenge, it was liberation. They left, loudly, with accusations and malice, and I remained in the silence of my own home, finally realizing that I was no longer responsible for them. A few months later, Dennis, Anya, and I went to an amusement park. It was a warm day. Anya was laughing and pulling us by the hands, demanding cotton candy. And it was there that I saw Maxim again. He was in a park employee's uniform, with a tired face and slumped shoulders. He noticed me, and something resembling shame flickered in his eyes. He quickly turned away and left, pushing a cart of equipment in front of him. I felt no schadenfreude, only a final understanding that the circle had closed. His path is his choice.
Mine is mine.
Returning home, I looked at Dennis, at Anya, at our life, and felt gratitude. Not for success, not for money, but for the fact that I no longer needed the approval of those who had once done everything to make me doubt myself. Sometimes losing a family isn't a tragedy, but a beginning. The beginning of your own story, in which you finally choose yourself.